Reading Scary Stories from the Scary Story app. Dream Man. One morning at breakfast, my husband seemed very tired. His face was pale and sweaty. When he reached out to pick up his cup of coffee, I noticed his hand was shaking. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Did you get enough sleep last night?" "I don't know," he replied. "I'm not sure if I was sleeping or if I was awake. Have you ever had a dream that felt so real that you weren't sure if it was actually a dream?" He paused for a long time before continuing. "Last night, I had one of those dreams," he said. "In the dream, I woke up in a cold sweat. My heart was racing, and I was breathing heavily. I went to the bathroom to get a drink of water, but something didn't feel right. I looked up and saw that the ceiling wasn't there anymore. Instead, it's as if I was looking up out of a grave. I could see the edges of the grave above me. There were people gathered around the gravesite, but I didn't recognize any of them except for one man. He looked exactly like me. Same eyes, same nose, same face, same everything. He bent over the grave and peered down at me. A broad smile spread across his face, and he said, 'You've lived long enough. Time to let someone else live for a while.' I went back to bed and lay down in bed, but I can't remember if I laid awake or fell asleep." The next morning, my husband came down for breakfast. He looked even worse. His hair was disheveled, and his brow was dripping with sweat. "I had the same dream again," he said, his voice shaking. He wouldn't say anything more, but as I left for work, I kissed him goodbye, and I could see the fear in his eyes. I began to get very worried. My husband had always been a calm and relaxed individual. Now it seemed as if he was turning into a nervous wreck. Every night, for the rest of the week, he had the same dream. Every morning before he left for work, he would tell me about the dream. His face grew gray, his eyes became haunted, and he began to look gaunt and sickly. I decided it was time to have him see a psychologist. However, on Sunday morning, he woke up much later than usual, and when he came down for breakfast, he looked as if the extra sleep had done him some good. He appeared to be healthy and vigorous again. "Did you have that dream last night?" I asked. He looked up at me. A broad smile spread across his face, and he said, "What dream? I have no idea what you're talking about." Bad dream. The little girl opened the door to her parents' bedroom in the middle of the night. "Daddy, I had a bad dream," she said. Her father blinked his eyes and sat up in bed, leaning on his elbows. The digital alarm clock glowed red in the darkness. It was 3:33 a.m. "Do you want to climb into bed and tell me about it?" he asked. "No, Daddy," came the reply. The oddness of the situation made him wake up more fully. He could barely make out his daughter's pale form outlined in the light of the doorway. "Why not, sweetie?" he asked. The little girl began to cry. "Because in my dream, when I told you about the dream, the thing wearing Mommy's skin sat up," she whined. For a moment he felt paralyzed, unable to take his eyes off his daughter. Then he felt the covers behind him slowly begin to shift. Go to sleep. For a tired child, bedtime is always a happy and relaxing event when they relax and drift off into a restful slumber. Some children complain when their parents force them to go to sleep before their bedtime. For me, bedtime was always a fearful and terrifying event that I dreaded every night. My fear for sleeping began when I was 8 years old. My parents moved me into my own bedroom, a small narrow room at the back of the house, just large enough for a bunk bed and a chest of drawers. It had only one window, which looked out the back garden and didn't let much light in. It was the first time I had ever slept on my own, and from the very first night, I remember experiencing a strange feeling of unease. As I lay on the top bunk trying to fall asleep, I thought I heard a noise. I couldn't be sure, but it seemed to be coming from the bottom bunk. The room was pitch black, and the curtains on the window let in just enough light to make out vague shapes in the dark. At first, I wasn't sure what the noise was. Sometimes the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving. I listened closely and realized that it was the unmistakable sound of bedsheets rustling in the dark. The bottom bunk was empty, but when I peered over the edge of my bed, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Something suddenly withdraw out of sight into the bottom bunk. Something did not wish to be seen. I lay there in disbelief, trying to convince myself it was just my fevered imagination running wild. I turned my face to the wall and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep quickly. The rustling noise beneath me steadily increased until I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was lurking in the bottom bunk began to toss and turn violently. Fear gripped my heart, and I had a terrible sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. My pulse was racing, and I broke out into a cold sweat. I could hear the sheets thrashing back and forth below me. Eventually, I couldn't take the tension anymore, and I cried out for my mother. Suddenly, the bunk bed began to shake violently, clattering against the wall. The bed sheets below me were twisting and turning. I couldn't get out of bed in case the thing in the bottom bunk reached out and grabbed me. I imagined it pulling me by the ankles and dragging me off into the darkness. I was trapped on the top bunk, like a cornered rat, unable to flee. I clutched my blanket with white knuckles and waited. The door finally burst open and my mother came in to calm me down. Tears were streaming down my face. She lay down in the empty bunk and promised to stay there until morning. Eventually, I was able to fall asleep. The next day, as I play in the backyard, I kept glancing up at my bedroom window. Each time, a chill ran down my spine and my hair stood on end. I felt like something was lurking in that room, watching me play and waiting for night to fall so it could be alone with me again. I tried to tell my parents about it, but they wouldn't listen to me. They just dismissed my claims as childish fears of the dark. And when night arrived, they ushered me upstairs and forced me to get into bed. "Go to sleep," said my mother. "Stop being such a baby." I didn't protest. It was no use. I resigned myself to my fate. Climbed up to the top bunk, got under the covers and waited. Lying there in the darkness, alone and frightened, I heard the quiet rustling of bed sheets and knew it was starting again. But this time, it was different. I heard the sound of slow, rasping breathing coming from the bottom bunk. The soft, labored wheezing made me shudder. Only a flimsy mattress separated me from whatever was lurking below. Lying there, paralyzed with fear, I just wanted the thing to leave me alone. Its labored breathing began louder and louder. Then suddenly, I felt something long and thin poking at the underside of my mattress. I screamed in horror, and the bunk bed began shaking violently. My mother came rushing in and calmed me down with a comforting hug. Eventually, my terror subsided, and with her standing guard, I was able to fall into an uneasy sleep. This continued for weeks. Night after night, I would wake up to the sound of rustling sheets. Every time I would scream for help, and the bed would begin shaking violently. As soon as my mother came in, everything would stop and she would have to spend the rest of the night in the bottom bunk, just so I could go to sleep. It was a very difficult time for my family. My grandmother was sick and my mother had to go to take care of her. When I found out that my mother would be away for the whole weekend, I flew into a panic. There would be no one there to protect me from that thing in the bottom bunk. No one would be answering my cries in the middle of the night. On the day my mother left, I rushed home after school and immediately stripped the bed sheets and the mattress off the lower bunk and removed all the slats. My plan was to prevent that thing from having a place to sleep for the night. I hoped that somehow this would protect me. Unfortunately, that night proved to be the most terrifying experience of all. To this day, I shudder to think about it. I managed to fall asleep, but in the middle of the night, something woke me up. The room was pitch black. There was no noise, no rustling of sheets, no movement at all. However, something didn't feel right. Just then, I felt the covers on my bed begin to move. The horrifying truth suddenly dawned on me. The wretched thing that had terrorized me night after night was not in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth to try to scream, but nothing came out. My eyes were wide with terror and I lay motionless, barely able to breathe. I didn't want to let it know I was awake. I could feel it lying beside me. Something cold and slimy leaning against my right arm. It was lying under the blanket. I could see its outline, but I didn't dare to look. All of a sudden it rolled over on top of me, and I felt its weight pressing down on me. I will never forget that awful feeling. Hours passed as I lay there motionless in the darkness, too frightened to move a muscle. I wanted to cry, but no tears would come out. Finally, I reached my breaking point. I couldn't bear it a moment longer. Ever so slowly, I tried to ease myself out from under it. Inch by painstaking inch, I shifted my weight, moving sideways. Just as I thought I was about to escape it, it moved. Dear God, it moved. I felt a clammy hand reach across my chest and close around my throat. Its grip gradually tightened, and I felt it squeeze my neck. The horrid, slimy thing began writhing and contorting under the blankets. I could hear it wheezing, rasping and coughing. I felt its breath against my face, foul and cold as ice. Dawn was breaking, and the first rays of sunshine were peeking through the curtains. I fought for dear life, but I was no match for it. As its scrawny fingers squeezed my neck, I felt life ebbing from me. I tried to scream, but the thing's grip was too tight. I was fighting to stay conscious when, suddenly, it released me and slowly withdrew, melting slowly into the wall. I tumbled out of bed and scrambled out of the bedroom. When I got downstairs, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had survived the most horrible experience of my life. To this day, I still break out into a cold sweat at the sound of bedsheets rustling in the night. I spent the entire day trying to convince my father to spend the night in my room. It took some effort, but he finally agreed. Perhaps he was just trying to humor me while my mother was away. Whatever the reason, it proved to be a smart move, because in one night, it solved the problem for good. The very next morning, he stormed into my room and told me to pack a suitcase. We were moving to a hotel. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this story time. This is Scrambled Egg. Stay excellent.